I'm Ozzie and welcome to Religion and Life. When we consider religious traditions around the globe, we sometimes think of the many ways religions divide us. My guest today, the Reverend Dr. Christy Lohr Sapp, has spent a considerable amount of her career searching for ways to build bridges between different religious faiths. And she'll help us understand the many ways interfaith efforts are informing religious traditions today. Welcome, Christy.
Thank you.
I'm really excited about hosting you on today's program. Christy is a former student from a while back at Appalachian and the Philosophy and Religion Department. And I think you also had an English degree, but we know where your loyalties lie. And you went on to study religion at the MA level and ultimately earn a PhD in theology. And you've had a really interesting career, non-traditional, I think, in terms of an academic profession in religious studies. So I want to recount that a little bit because you probably heard that when you were a student, what are you going to do with a religion degree? Mm-hmm. So I want you to tell me and tell our guests what you've done with a religion degree and just the various ways you can use a humanities degree in general.
I've traveled the world with a religion degree. That's been one of the highlights for me. I immediately after my time at App went to live in Kenya and worked for the Lutheran Church there as a volunteer journalist, writing human interest pieces about what the church was doing in the lives of people in East Africa. And with the help of my college mentor, found a graduate program that I liked, that I could commit to and could commit to me, with every intention of going back to East Africa. And I imagined that I would never return to live full-time in the U.S., but I did. But after graduate school, I got a job with the World Council of Churches, which really opened up to me the world of religious nonprofits and the ecumenical side of inter-religious relations in terms of Christian communions working together around issues of peace and justice and equality and education. And through that, got to travel myriad places and have wonderful experiences, which ultimately landed me in New York, where I worked in an interfaith organization for a couple of years.
Yeah. So travel, you mentioned, but this idea of religious nonprofits, this is something that I think some people don't think of. They think of immediately kind of going into parish ministry. And you finally did make your way to parish ministry years later, and that's what you're doing now. And I don't want you to leave out your stint as Associate Dean of the Chapel at Duke University. That's pretty incredible there. It must have been a very interesting time in your life.
It was. I was living in New York City and finishing up my doctoral work before the move to Durham and Duke. And I was, having worked in the religious nonprofit world, and particularly in the Christian nonprofit world for so long, I was very adamant that I wanted to be a lay person, that I was not going to be preaching every week or administering the sacraments, which are the things that ordination, allows you to do. And I didn't want to preach every week because I didn't want to write a 2,000-word essay every week. Right. And I felt that I didn't need to be administering the sacraments. And there were too many people I saw who were ordained in desk jobs rather than living out sacramental lives. But dang it, if sitting in the chancel of Duke Chapel on an Easter morning, when you have your back up against the wooden wall and the organ is playing and you feel the vibrations of worship, and I was sitting there watching somebody else celebrate Eucharist, and I thought, I could do that.
Right.
Maybe I want to do that. Do I want to do that? No, I don't want to do that. Maybe I do want to do that, which started the path that has now led me into the parish. I imagine, every week writing a 2,000-word essay.
I imagine preaching and worshiping in Duke Chapel could bring a lot of people to that decision in life. And I guess you have to be careful what you say you're not going to do, right?
I was warned against that.
But you're sort of the poster child. You've traveled, you've been a writer, you've been editor of a journal, you've been working in nonprofit religious organizations, specifically focusing on interfaith work, and I want to come back to that. You've been in an academic setting, you've taught classes, and now you're in parish ministry. So I feel better telling my students you can do anything you want to if you're committed to following that lifestyle. So,
And if you're willing to think outside the box, be creative, and eat a lot of peanut butter.
right. Yeah, it doesn't pay the greatest, right? I want to pick up on because you've had a particular passion. You've mentioned three things: interfaith work, social justice, and peace studies. Let's talk about the interfaith work. I think sometimes when we think about religion, we kind of get holed into our own particular tradition. We're committed to a particular faith stance. So what drew you to working between the faiths, if you will, or to working with this kind of ecumenical approach to viewing the global religions?
Well, you were quick to throw away the English portion of my undergraduate degree, but when I came to App thinking that I was going to go off and join the Peace Corps and change the world that way, and felt that being a liberal arts major, humanities major, was the way to do that because it was a diversified portfolio in a way. I took my first religious studies class at App, and it was like that scene in the Bible where the scales fall off the guy's eyes and he can see all of a sudden a whole new world was opened up to me that I had not experienced growing up in Western North Carolina in a predominantly Christian world. And it was an African religions class, and it was riveting. And I won't mention the name of the professor who taught that class, but for me, it also connected story with religion and culture. And I began to see the ways in which good authors can't separate their religious identity from their creative spirit, and that the stories that we're raised on and that become part of who we are get woven into the stories that we tell. And that's true across cultures and across peoples and across traditions. And you can learn so much more about a person's culture through their religion by understanding something about that framework that their ethic and their values and their storytelling is based on.
Yeah, so you've always had an interest in religion and literature, and that comes out in what you just said. So the commonality I'm sensing here about the various global religions is this grounding in story, personal and cultural.
And the ways they connect us, because they're not separate siloed stories. We have so many elements, threads that connect throughout our traditions that it's humbling, I think, and it's binding.
Right. So when you're working with people from various faiths, is that the way you approach it, finding commonality in common stories? I mean, obviously, I would think that if you sit down and start talking about the various beliefs and the creeds, and you're probably asking for divisiveness and trouble. So do the stories pull people in, and do they find commonality there?
I think they do, and I think there's a balance there, because there are real differences in the ways that our religious traditions train us to see the world. But there are also those differences even within traditions, and so finding the commonality can be a great way to start and to build relationship. I think when you get to a truer, richer means of engaging, you get to the point where you can talk about the differences as well, but you do it after recognizing the humanity, the shared humanity of the other person.
Right.
And so, you don't want to start out with Muslims are strictly monotheistic and they think that Christians are tritheists, and that's one of the things that divide us. You might want to start out with the fact that they both have great reverence for the same prophets,
right,
and believe the stories of those prophets, and maybe interpret them differently, and start with that.
That's an excellent point. In one of my classes, I have students read stories about Jesus, not knowing where it comes from, and they don't realize they're reading from the Quran. And it's a bit of a surprise and a shock and an eye-opener to them. All right, so you mentioned that you could sit down with people of various faiths and find plenty to disagree about right off the bat, but I'm guessing that you have found ways to find issues that can create a cooperative spirit among people of different faiths. What are some of the issues that people coming from different faith perspectives can sit down at a table and cooperate on or find common ground on? Do you have any kind of stories or examples to talk about there?
Yeah, I mean, I think many of the social issues of our days and the justice issues of today are things that people of different faith traditions can coalesce around. And I think we've seen this through things like William Barber's Poor People's Campaign and efforts at immigration reform and prison reform and gun violence. And there are a lot of those social issues that have such an impact on people across the board that they can come together around them. Even freedom of religion laws and issues. I'm trying to think of a specific example that we've worked on. Well, feeding hungry people. All of our traditions say something about reaching out to the marginalized and the oppressed and feeding the hungry. And we used to do interfaith programs at Duke with the students, and the Muslim students were particularly enthusiastic about this, where we would come together for an afternoon and make sandwiches and send them down to the local soup kitchen. And because we all have an understanding that feeding the hungry is something that our traditions ask us to do. So there's the very basic level of caring for your neighbor that we can do together, but then that can also be scaled up to a larger understanding of neighbor and a larger understanding of concern.
Yes, you mentioned Duke. When I think of Duke, I mean, we both spent time there in different capacities. I think of a fairly conservative college for the most part. It's historically Methodist. But you mentioned Muslim students. So how do interfaith activities work among the students there? Are they successful generally, or is there any pushback from the community? Or
it depends on what the issue and activity is. I think it's hard for anybody to complain about young people coming together to feed hungry people.
Right.
You know, that's nothing. Now, you know, where people worship and how they worship, sometimes there's pushback on when we make idols of our structures, of our buildings, of our ways of worship, of our ways of being together. Then you start to get pushback when those are tested. And we certainly saw that in the student community at Duke. But I felt that my job there was to help students of any persuasion find a way to authentically practice their religious traditions.
So if we can get together over issues like feeding the hungry, okay, I could see that. What about if you push that issue a little further and start to talk about income inequality? Does that get too personal? Does it hit too close to home, or is there common ground there among the traditions as well? Because I kind of think from my own tradition, in the Christian tradition, it's hard to find common ground on some things like income inequality, although it appears to be a fairly obvious mandate when I read
well, and
the Gospels,
I think income inequality often ties directly to gender inequality. And we certainly have a commonality in a lot of our traditions of gender disparity and access for women to do things in a different way than men. There was a report I heard just yesterday about how jobs that have traditionally been held by men start to pay less when women enter that workforce. And so I think there are ways that all of our faith communities can work towards fair wages and workers' rights and justice. And part of that is also working for gender equity, I think, and equality.
So that's a pretty progressive stance for a Christian minister to take. So I might want to come back to that in a little bit when we get to more of your work in the parish. But I want to follow up again on another kind of interfaith issue here. I know when you were a student, we would talk a lot about religious illiteracy among college students, and then among society in general. We simply, as a culture, don't know a whole lot about the world traditions, and as you so pointed out earlier, we don't oftentimes know a lot about our own traditions. So religious illiteracy is a kind of common plague, I think, in our culture in the 21st century. How do we combat that, and what is the danger of allowing a populace to remain basically illiterate about the world traditions?
I'll start with the danger, because I think that's probably easier to answer in some ways. So I was living in Manhattan on September 11th, 2001, and went to work that morning, like lots of people living in Manhattan did. The first retaliatory act of violence that happened in the U.S. after 9/11 was the murder of a Sikh man, Balbir Singh, in Arizona, because a person decided he was going to take revenge on the Arabs for the attacks of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and he took his anger out on a gas station owner in Arizona who was not Muslim and was not Arab. I don't remember the name of the person who committed that crime, but he had no idea what a Muslim was, what who a Sikh is, the difference between the two. I suspect he might not have even known the difference between the Punjab region and the Middle East.
Right.
And that to me is a very precise example of the danger of religious illiteracy. There are millions of other examples that are less life and death, but I think that when we don't know enough to know the difference in who people are and what they believe and where our frustration and anger even should be directed, then we can cause actual physical harm to people. Now, one of the ways we combat it is exposure and conversation. Like one of the programs I ran when I lived in New York was a program where we took people to visit different places of worship. It's surprising to me how seldom we get into each other's spaces in respectful and welcoming ways. I don't have a statistic, but I would hazard a guess that very few white American Christians have even worshiped in an African American Christian church, much less visited a mosque or a gurdwara or a temple. And so just having curiosity enough to engage the questions of who is my neighbor and how do they worship and what do their scriptures say, that can be done by reading each other's texts. And quite frankly, that might not be the best way into it because some of our texts are pretty dry and hard to access. But it can be done through our programs of formation for children and youth, and working with them to engage them around questions. There are Christy Stendahl, a Lutheran bishop who taught up in Boston, talked about holy envy, that we need to find in each other's traditions something that we wish we had in our own. Not to appropriate it, because Americans are really good about taking what they think is good and making it their own, but to have holy envy around it. And I think that once we start peeling back the mystery and the fear and the uncertainty of other traditions, we can find both those things that are common, like the stories of Jesus and Quran and the Christian scriptures, but also those things that we wish we had a little of in our own traditions.
That's really nice. I like the phrase holy envy. I've heard that before, and it's really a nice concept. This is obviously something you're quite passionate about, and I can imagine you living in New York. You can visit these various communities of worship together, and there's a much more culturally dynamic setting. We live in the mountains of North Carolina, so when we talk, if I were to talk about taking students or a group of people around to various houses of worship, it would be difficult, very difficult. There's some cultural diversity, but not nearly what you'd find in an urban setting, for example. So how would we go about that? How would we go about breaking down walls? Or even the challenge I find is convincing people that it's important to learn about others and their ways of viewing the world differently.
I mean, I think one thing that's essential is just getting out of our own contexts, and for some people that might mean going farther afield. I had a great awakening in my African religions class here in Watauga County.
I'm just going to say it. That was our first contact, right? You were in my African religions class. Okay, go ahead.
But it wasn't your class. It was a class you had to take over.
That's one I inherited.
But sometimes we need to get out of our comfort zones, and sometimes that's a geographic thing. Sometimes it's an intellectual thing. Certainly, I grew up with the Reading Rainbow, and books are ways that we can get out of that and learn more. I think a field trip is always a good idea, and it brings people together and it creates an experience. And it's not that far to Charlotte from here, and so I think if there aren't those opportunities within your immediate community, you can find them and make them, or you can bring in others as well to.
So you're not in Kenya anymore, you're not in New York City anymore, you're not in Canada, you are in Hickory, North Carolina, and you find yourself leading a parish. Obviously, these are still topics that are important to you, so you're still focusing on interfaith work, peace, and social justice emphases. Is that you finding ways to do that within in the parish setting?
I am. It's different, but I think it's also important. It's you're on a university campus and you have a little microcosm of the world. They're in an ideal situation, and a church can be much more homogenous, and so. Finding the natural ways to do that. I've joined, I'm now a card-carrying member of the NAACP,
Oh, really?
Which I wasn't before I moved to Hickory, but that's one of the ways that I can put myself in a situation where I engage and interact with people who maybe aren't worshiping with me on a Sunday morning, and then can bring my members along with me to things that go on in the community. I find the pulpit preaching to be an educational exercise as much as a spiritual exercise, and so finding ways to weave in stories in that context I think is important. Lifting up the ways in which our own scriptures are about religious diversity is also part of that, and we've got to remember Jesus wasn't Christian,
Right.
And he wasn't operating in a Christian climate, and so underscoring those connections that we have, and the examples that we see of crossing boundaries and engaging in diversity through our own texts, it's there.
Yeah.
We just have to talk about it.
That's great. So you're a pastor in a church that's part of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. I would imagine that the word evangelical perhaps means something different in a Lutheran context than it does in a Baptist context in the South. How do you see your own tradition as being evangelical? What does that mean to you? And does it relate to this very passionate view of ministry that you have, engaging others where they are?
It does. So the evangelical part of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America is one of those words that that we don't hide it under a bushel, we proclaim it, but it's about proclamation. It's about proclaiming who we are and God's gift of love that we see in the incarnation and in Jesus Christ. And the evangelical part of it also connects us to other congregations in the same way that the Catholic part of the creed connects us to the larger church.
Right.
The evangelical part is a proclamation of also a sense of kindredness and relationship to other Lutherans, other Christians, other Protestants around the world.
So you actually see it as a means of building bridges beyond your own tradition.
Yeah.
It is the thing that the evangelical part of your faith is what projects you outward.
Yeah,
into
and
the world.
the ELCA is a denomination in the United States that has more ecumenical full communion partnerships where we can share clergy and share the table of Eucharist together, I think, than any other tradition. We're full communion partners with the Episcopal Church USA, with the Presbyterian Church USA, with the United Methodist Church, with the Moravian Church. And I think that's one of the ways that the Spirit is lived out in the ELCA.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's fascinating. I'm so proud of you. We're so proud of you here at Appalachian. What a career, and you're just getting started. It's going to be fun to see where you end up next. I thank you for coming today and talking about issues that are important to me, interfaith issues, peace, social justice. So glad that you're on the forefront of those out in the world. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, that's it for Religion and Life this week. Join us next week when my guest will be the well-known activist for social justice, writer, preacher, and editor of Sojourners magazine, Jim Wallace. Until then, this is Ozzie Ostwald.